From Starter Villain by John Scalzi. Did you train that cat to attack people? Jacobs asked. No, I said. She's just a good judge of character.
Welcome back to the Reading Room Ruffians, your favorite library podcast. It's me, Mallory. Fully upset, the topic today is about tech chips and not potato chips. I'm joined by my BFF Ariel, seriously displeased by the lack of snackage going on in today's episode.
I mean, for real, there's potato chips, there's chocolate chips, there's pickle chips.
So many chips. Our Supreme Overlord Carla is here to try and keep us quiet.
Yeah, I think I'll pass on the pickle chips.
We are recording from our library in Jackson County, West Virginia. Zach, our tour guide for today's tour through Nerd City, is joining us from Seattle, Washington.
You know, I think these chips are still technically crunchy.
That's great.
Well, there's the title for today. Okay. Okay. Coming up in our libraries, we have a plant swap on September 17th in Ravenswood, and that's at 6 p.m. We will also be having a Teen Tuesday on September 17th in Ravenswood, and they will be doing an Xbox contest and a nail spa, like a nail spa day at 5 p.m. And then we will have a Steam night on September 17th in Ripley at 6 p.m. We'll be doing chromatography experiments with leaves. Fingers crossed that they don't all die before then. Let me see. We will also have building critter castles on September 19th in Ravenswood at 6 p.m. We will then have 90s trivia on September 19th in Ripley at 6 p.m. And then we have Mommy and Me every Friday in Ravenswood at 12 p.m. And that's for moms with babies up to a year old.
Well, we have Mysticon coming up too.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to try to grab one of the staff from Ravenswood for our podcast next week so they can talk about it.
Good. Yeah, Mysticon is I'm going to go this year.
Yeah, you are, because we have a booth.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
What is
I need
Mysticon?
to actually get crafting. I'll need to get
It's like
crafting.
a paranormal con. It's all the like the cryptids and the ghosts and the,
Aliens.
weird stuff, aliens, yeah.
Yeah.
They've got a really cool shirt this year too. It's got Bigfoot and an alien walking underneath a UFO.
Love that.
Anyway, it's a cool design this year. It's really good. So they're excited. I'm excited. It'll be fun.
I love it. Yeah, so today we're talking about Zach's nonfiction, The Chip Wars, and we will let him get to it.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the Chip Wars today, which is a book about not potato chips or chocolate chips, but about computer chips, which are less tasty, but as I said, probably still crunchy. I don't know. I've never eaten one. So this is a book.
You know? I could. Somebody get me one.
There you
We'll
go.
try
We'll
it.
get you some silicon wafers and see if they are delicious or not. This is a book written by historian Chris Miller, and he was actually not going to write a book about this. He was looking to write a book about the Cold War, apparently. I saw an interview with him a bit ago, and that's what his goal was. But then as he looked more and more into it, he started looking at computer chips, because that was a big deal in the Cold War. Basically, we had computer chips that could actually do things, and the Russians did
I was
not.
going to say, how did he get so far off track?
It's all about weapon systems. It's all about weapon systems. Like, it was like, apparently at some point during the Cold War, the Russians calculated that if we did a preemptive strike, the U.S. did, we could probably knock out something like 98% of every single nuke they had, because our targeting systems were just straight up way better than theirs. So they got scared and they started doing, like, chip espionage type stuff. Anyway, we'll get to that. Okay, so if we go way back to, I believe it was 1945. This is when the first silicon chip was ever made. Or I guess the first, well, it wasn't made yet. First theorized. You got this guy, his name is William Shockley. And he was from Palo Alto. He's a physicist. He first theorized that the qualities of semiconductors, which I'll explain in a second, could make them better alternatives to mechanical switches, because back in the day, computers used to be basically just a series of mechanical switches, vacuum tubes, that type of stuff. And basically, a semiconductor is something, a material, that has the properties of... it can be conductive, basically, like a metal, but only under certain circumstances. Like if you place a specific kind of charge on either side of it, you put extra stuff in whatever the semiconductor is to make it, they call it doping, right? You just put junk in there to make it more conductive, less conductive. And it lives right on that threshold of being not conductive and conductive. Basically, what they'll do is they'll flip a little switch and they will make it conductive or not. And whether it's conducting or not basically means that that's a 1 or a 0. So if you think about computer language, everything's in 1s and 0s. So if you can make a switch effectively, then you can make some sort of a logic gate. A logic gate would be like an AND gate or an OR gate or something like that. In this case, an AND gate would be something like, I have a 1 and I have a 1. So because I have two 1s, 1 and 1, then that means that's a yes, another 1. If I have a 1 and a 0, that means they're not both 1, so you get a 0 at the other end. Does that make sense? You need to have both things for an AND gate. For an OR gate, you only need one thing. And there's a bunch of different gates. If you want to look into them, there's a bunch of different ones. People have made computers based on this simple logic in basically everything. Like, they've done it in Minecraft. I saw one recently, they did it in Terraria. But anything that you can make these gates with in some fashion, you can make a computer with. Doesn't have to be a good one, but you can make a computer with it. And that's how they used to work back in the day.
I have a question.
Sure.
Has the switches changed since then? I mean, it sounds like we've gotten better switches, but it's still like the vacuum tubes and stuff. It's still the switches. Like,
oh yeah, it's all just switches.
On or off.
Yeah, it's all just on or off. Literally, your entire computer runs on that.
And it still is.
Yes.
Okay.
It all just runs on this exact thing, just whether switch is on or off. I mean, you can get very complicated things, but you can effectively make any number do any sort of math with this combination of just 1s and 0s, right?
Okay.
Like, you can do everything with decimal, which is 0 to 10, or 0 to 9, that's 10 numbers. Binary is the language that computers use, and it's just 0 and 1. So because they're both complete number systems, you can do anything with either. It's just that we can actually physically control 0s and 1s. Now, once you start getting into like quantum computers, you get some weird stuff happening where it's 0 or 1 or anything in between, or some superposition of all these things, and it makes it very complicated. But we're talking about good old-fashioned classical computers in this, because ain't nobody got time for quantum stuff. They don't even use really chips there. They just got craziness. Anyway, so we are one paragraph into this summary, so we're going to have to move through it a little bit. So yeah, William Shockley, he theorized that semiconductors could be an alternative to mechanical switches. This is a good idea because they're small, they wouldn't have to physically move, stuff like that. Later on, John Bardeen, this is 2 years later, and he's actually the only 2-time winner of the Nobel Prize in physics, apparently, which is wild. And another physicist named Walter Brattain, proved that you could do this in 1947. And what they did was basically they were controlling electrical current along a piece of germanium, not geranium, that's a flower, germanium at AT&T's Bell Labs. And the company called the device a transistor. This is the first transistor. This is what all computers are made out of, basically. And Shockley actually won the Nobel Prize for this semiconductor theory in 1956. So basically, he came up with it. They showed that it worked. Shockley got the Nobel Prize. And nobody really knew specifically what you could use it for, aside from maybe it could be used for switches, right? Later on, we got 1958, Jack Kilby, who's an engineer at Texas Instruments in Dallas. And Texas Instruments, they're the ones who make those calculators that everybody loves, the TI-89. Side tangent, TI-89, that calculator that everybody uses in high school, That thing is still over $100. Isn't that ridiculous?
Why?
Wow.
It's because they
Also,
yeah.
I just want to say that it's wild that this man won a Nobel Peace Prize thing, and nobody was like really sure what that could do. They could do with it. It's just like, yeah, that's a cool idea. You win.
Well, it was like, it's a switch. You can do a
But
switch.
they were right.
It is neat. I mean, even just as a physics concept, it's pretty cool that you can control this thing in sort of like a switch-like manner, basically. The issue is you couldn't get any readings from it. There's like, I think initially when they were trying to do this, they made the semiconductor thing, and they just couldn't detect how small the changes in current were, basically, is what it was. So they didn't think it worked. But yeah, Texas Instruments, the reason why they're so expensive, those calculators, apparently, is because they're the only ones that are approved for use in high school and on standardized tests. So they just can. Those things probably cost like $2 to make. They're making huge profits.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in Texas, so Jack Kilby, like I said, at TI, he discovered that instead of making separate semiconductors for each transistor, which is what people were thinking about doing beforehand, you could put many transistors on the same piece of germanium or silicon as what is called an integrated circuit, also known as a chip. The reason it's called a chip is because the way they would make these is that they would take a big piece of silicon and they would chip off a piece of it. So they called them chips.
Oh my God.
Yep, that's literally the reason why it's called a chip.
That's wild.
So when they were doing this back in the day, the way it was done was basically they would put little bits of wax, right? Little globs of wax. And they would trace out the circuits basically by hand, right? And they would then use different processes, chemical processes, to etch away the silicon in certain locations where the wax wasn't, and then they would remove the wax, polish it up, and then you would have a circuit that way. This is obviously not how we have computer chips now, but that's what they were doing back then.
Well, even back then, you would have thought they would have used like a similar technology to like a printing press. They just make a sample circuit and stamp it in, and then...
Yeah, you could not do that because of just the material. But yeah, that's something they had, I think, considered, something like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the first processes was this wax chemical stuff, but
yeah.
Later, a man named J. Lathrop joined Texas Instruments in 1958, and he and his assistant, James Nall, used the lens of a microscope, and photoresists, which are chemicals that are activated by light, to print patterns on germanium. And basically, you would print the pattern on there with you'd have a bright light shining through this effectively pattern, right? And that would etch things out based on whether the light hit the location or not because of the photoresistive chemicals. This process, and the process that we used from then on, basically, is called photolithography. You might have heard that term before. This is basically what it does. You shine light onto chemicals that react to the light on the chip. So you can make this smaller and smaller and smaller.
I don't think I've ever heard of that.
No,
before.
me either.
Okay, maybe it's just like a thing in...
Nerd thing.
It's just a nerd thing. I don't know. I've heard of photolithography before it became like a software engineer, so maybe it's got to be just a nerd thing. I don't know. Anyway, so then we go, I'm going to hop forward a little bit. In 1963, we started having these U.S. chip companies opening production facilities in Asian nations. The reason they did that is because they started to think, well, we've got this way of making these chips, which can be used for calculating things, and they are more expensive to make in the U.S. because, we have to pay our workers or whatever, than they are in Asia. So they started hiring Asian people over in Asian nations, so like, Japan, China, whatever. I think the first big ones were in Hong Kong, mostly just because of those lower labor costs. So the first one, I think, was Fairchild Semiconductor. They shipped chips to Hong Kong for assembly in 1963 and became the first of many U.S. semiconductor firms to send chips to assembly offshore in Asia. And they initially paid the Hong Kong workers 25 cents an hour, which even in 1960s money is not very much, but it's more than they were making elsewhere. So it was a decent enough wage for them back then. In 1965, Fairchild co-founder Gordon Moore predicted that the maximum number of transistors on a single computer chip would double every year. He said until 1975. And you might have heard of this one, actually. It's called Moore's Law.
I have.
Okay, so Moore's Law is just that thing. You double the number of transistors on a computer chip every so often, right? I think it was every year at first, now it's every 2 years. I don't think we're actually hitting Moore's Law anymore because of just we're running into physics constraints. Like you can only make stuff so small before, you're on the size of atoms. And you've got, silly things like leakage and quantum tunneling to contend with. Once you start actually looking at atoms instead of bulk material, you have issues. So we're getting to the point where that's not possible. But yeah, this is the guy who came up with Moore's Law, which was true for like more than 50 years. It's been going and going and going. Later in 1968, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore left their jobs at Fairchild and founded the semiconductor company Intel, which you've definitely heard of, in Silicon Valley. It wasn't called Silicon Valley then, though. 2 years later, Intel introduced its first product, a dynamic random access memory chip, or DRAM, and it expanded its semiconductor product line to include the I don't know if it's 4004 or 4004, I can't remember, which it identifies the first microprocessor, which is effectively just a computer on a chip. And that combines the functions of a logic chip, which is those things with the gates, and a memory chip. So this is DRAM stuff, so that it can actually remember things. So that's pretty cool. Actually, I think it was Noyce and Moore are the two big ones, but there were 8 people who left Fairchild back then. And if I'm remembering this correctly, the main reason they left is because they were just like not getting any stock in the company, right? And most of them just wanted to become rich.
Oh, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I mean, it makes sense. And like back then, this is back in the 60s, getting stock in a company was not a thing that people did. This became like a thing later on, but it was not a thing that people did back then. So these people would like invent these things and do stuff, and they would just get basically no credit past their salary. Sure.
You keep talking about these transistors and stuff like that, right? And all I can think of is transistor radios. That related at all?
Yeah, so transistor radios will get, I don't know if it's really a big thing in this summary here. But basically, transistor...
Wait, we're still on the summary?
It's his summary.
His summary.
His summary of the book.
Like
yeah.
the notes.
It's the notes. Yeah, the
Gotcha,
stuff that's
gotcha.
important. I'm just like, I don't know if I talk about it
I
in
was
the
like,
summary.
wait a minute.
Yeah.
No, I read the book. I finished it like 2 days ago. And I've been trying to like come up with a good summary, but it's a hard book to summarize because there's so many days, so many people, and so many like little details. And I'm remembering things that are not in the summary as we go along. So that's why I keep getting sidetracked. So the transistor radios, right? If I remember correctly, they were mostly like made in Japan at the time, right? Just because they found a little niche where they could slip in and start making some stuff. And it was like Samsung and people who made them, or no, Sony. Might have been Sony. Anyway, one of those Japanese companies. But yeah, transistor radios replaced like crystal radios and stuff back in the day, right? So transistor radios, they were very small radios that you could carry around with you, basically, for the most part. Because they used to have to use like all this big stuff and like vacuum tubes and junk like that, and you have transistors, you don't have to use that stuff, so they can make them way smaller, which is nice. Okay, so moving on. By the end of the 70s, you had semiconductor plants operating in Asian countries that hosted U.S. military bases such as the Philippines, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. So basically all over the place. And the government policy after World War II supported Japan's redevelopment as center of science and technology in what they called an American-led system. However, when Japan surpassed the United States in chip production in 1986, the Defense Department saw that the semiconductor producers were subsidized by the Japanese government, and they were sort of a threat to U.S. national security. Basically, because Japan was starting to get a little bit too uppity with its chip production. We started getting a little spooked by that. And Japan started thinking that, oh, well, we're getting pretty advanced stuff here. Maybe we should actually make our own military, and maybe we should be the guys in charge of this sort of relationship here, instead of just being this demilitarized group protected by the U.S. Because at that point, they controlled something like 70% of the global market for lithography equipment, which is how you make all these chips. And the U.S. companies kept moving stuff out there kept buying things from Japan because they were less expensive than chip suppliers domestically, which is just a thing. Basically, a lot of the Asian countries, because they were trying to catch up to this sort of stuff, China gets really bad about this later on, but they just kept getting subsidized by the government and making cheaper and cheaper stuff so that people in the U.S. and other places would buy their chips instead of domestic chips. And in fact, it was the reason why we stopped making mostly domestic chips here in the U.S.
So we basically, trying to save $1, sold ourselves out.
Yeah, this is what we call capitalism. Always happens. Yeah. It's kind of ridiculous, honestly. I mean, it makes sense. The individual
At the time,
decisions,
it does.
yeah, always makes sense. But this is like just an issue with the system in general. We're mostly looking for short-term financial gains and not the long-term effect of those short-term financial gains.
Yeah.
Which sucks and is going to come back and bite us eventually. It's already starting to in many different things. This is a big one. Like the chip stuff is a huge one. But yeah. So anyway, moving on. We got Samsung, the leader of Samsung, Lee Byung-chul, developed the company into a leading force in semiconductor industries after 1983. Before that, I wanted to say it was Samsung that was they sold produce or something like that. It was something silly.
I would have never went there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Samsung. Let me double check that before I go on. Sold. Well, it's like Nintendo, right? They
yeah,
used to sell playing cards. That's what they were.
Yeah, but that kind of fits. I mean, playing cards to games.
Yeah. No, he sold noodles. And other goods.
Noodles.
I could have swore they said
Samsung
bananas
noodles.
in the book, but maybe it was just noodles. Yeah, they did not sell chips. He just had some money, and he's like, you know what? I think these chips are going to be a big thing. Let's do that.
Oh my god!
And
I'm gonna take my noodle money and invest.
well, no, it was even.
I love that.
It was even better than that. He had his noodle money, right? But he also just went to the South Korean government and was like, "Hey, can I make chips?" And they're like, "Here's $400 million."
Whoa!
I don't think they gave it all to
He didn't
him,
even-
but a lot of it was given to him to make this domestic chip industry.
Wow, he didn't have to use his noodle money.
Yeah.
No.
So
That's great.
after that, Intel and other Silicon Valley companies at the time reduced their dependence on Japanese chip manufacturers, and they went over to Samsung to make chips under their brand names, basically. Which is wild.
That is wild.
I'm not going to lie. I'm just sitting here thinking about how good his noodles might have been.
I mean, they could have been amazing, but no,
Does it-
instead we got fans.
They could have been. I want to know. Does he still make them? Like on his off time? Does he make himself noodles?
Send us
I
some
think he's
nudes.
dead now.
Oh,
No, because he was getting old at the time, if I remember correctly, towards the end of the book, but I'm not sure. I guess I could look
That's
that
a good
up, but-
story, though.
Yeah, it is a
It's
good story. That's what,
Yeah.
he started as a noodle business, basically, and then moved up to making, being the largest company in all of South Korea.
See, that's foresight. That is some serious foresight.
Yeah, no, he got in there.
It's like he saw this trend and got in when it was, just starting. And I mean, that was smart.
Yeah, I can't remember how much it was. It's something like 10 or 20% of all of South Korea's GDP comes from Samsung. They've got a city, if I'm remembering correctly, basically.
Wow.
It's
He probably
wild.
got tired of fighting the noodle competition.
That's what it was.
Mhm.
I imagine there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
There probably is. All right, so hopping back over to the U.S., we have Silicon Valley businessman William Perry basically we had what we were calling like quote unquote smart missiles and smart bombs and things like that. They weren't that smart back then because they used, again, vacuum tubes and stuff like that. So this guy, William Perry, he saw, wait a second, the military potential of these microprocessors, if we use those instead of these vacuum tubes and stuff because they're lighter, smaller, less prone to failure, then we can probably start selling these things to the military and get a ton of money that way. So he thought about this in 1977, which is a fantastic year. That's when Star Wars came out, the first one. And he went to
Yay!
He joined the U.S. government and Undersecretary of Defense as Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, and he pushed for upgraded weaponry, including improved guided missiles, which was done through DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Whew. These names, I swear.
Remind me to tell you a story about DARPA after this is over.
Okay, will do. But yeah, so he started doing this for DARPA, right? Pushing for this thing. Around the same time, you have this physicist Carver Mead. He worked at the Lynn Company, which is a computer architect at Xerox, and he helps come up with these rules-based foundation for the computer software that automates the task of designing chips. And there was somebody else, and Lynn Conway, yeah. Carver Mead and Lynn Conway. But those two came up with this sort of thing because basically they were thinking, well, we have these chips, right, that all had to be designed by hand. That's what they were done with before then. Basically, you had people coming up with these architectures and coming up with these chip designs with literally, I don't think it was paper, but, a piece of paper, a ruler, and some, like, cutting, marking stuff, right, to help project things down onto that. And because of this, you couldn't really scale that very well. It was very difficult and very time-consuming to make new chips. So what these two did, Mead and Conway, is that they came up with just basically these rules that said, okay, if you need to do this sort of thing, right, you can just pop that sort of a gate into this software and it would make it for you. So basically this allowed
that's handy.
This methodology, which Conway taught later at MIT, was used to design chips from then on out. In fact, Conway was, because she was teaching this at MIT, had a class where people would design the chips, right? It was a computer architecture class. And she had each student design a chip that was sent to a fabrication facility, or fab, which we'll talk about more later. And they were essentially made and brought back and put into fully functional chips. And DARPA was very excited about this. This milestone, which was later called the Meade-Conway Revolution. And they started financing a program that enabled researchers at universities to design chips for production in highly advanced fabs, which allowed us to keep a military advantage for the United States and motivated DARPA to keep Moore's Law alive. So basically the reason Moore's Law has been so successful is because us and other companies and other governments have been like pouring money into this, right? It wouldn't have happened otherwise. At around this same time, actually a little bit before, you have the KGB, because we were in the Cold War at the time. They established a new division called Directorate T. Well, this is according to the CIA. And its mission was to acquire Western technology and equipment with a focus on the production of integrated circuits. And what the Soviet Union did was basically steal and copy all of the designs that the U.S. had that they could get their hands on. But they never actually got it to large-scale production because they just didn't have the people or the equipment as much. And even if you copy all of this stuff, because you need these experienced engineers who actually know how to run it and know all the little details, you can't really reproduce it, right? So copying it effectively meant that they would copy something, a process, get some equipment. They would take like a year or two to set it up. And by that time, they were already like, 2, 3, 4, 5 years behind, right? Because of how long it took to set everything up and get everything running and getting everybody trained up. So this copy it method did not work. The technology was moving too fast.
Things would have, I was going to say, it'd be advancing too fast.
Yeah, stuff was just moving too fast. When if you take a snapshot this time, the amount of time it takes you to get spun up to make that thing, it's been too long, and they've already got a new process and smaller stuff and better stuff. So this copy it strategy that the USSR had actually backfired on them because it just meant that the US was able to pull ahead, basically exponentially, effectively, right? Because it's doubling every few years. And we showcased this, the US did, this advantage, at the start of the Persian Gulf War. In fact, it was specifically on January 17th, 1991, when F-117 bombers entered Iraqi airspace and targeted Baghdad, right? The bombers used Sidewinder air-to-air missiles with semiconductor-driven guidance systems, and they were 6 times more accurate than the Vietnam-era version of the Sidewinder. So I think it was Vietnam when we had the first version of the Sidewinder, right? That's when we just started at the very end of the Vietnam War to use these more advanced missiles and things. But back in the day, when they had these vacuum tube based bombs and missiles and things, you're getting like a 10% hit rate, maybe. And for the bombs, you're getting maybe it's within 1,000 feet of the target. It's like ridiculous. We were so inaccurate. That's the reason why they would just drop like thousands and thousands of bombs, because they couldn't hit anything otherwise, even with guidance systems. So instead, they started using
some of those are.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Some of those early guidance systems, they had trained pigeons.
Yeah, that was a thing.
Pack at a certain. It's like it's a pigeon.
Apparently, the pigeon ones were decent.
Was better than the others, but it's like they use pigeons. So
yeah, we weren't. I mean, it's very inventive. It didn't work very well, but it worked better than some of the other methods we were using. So
yeah.
But later on, when we had these advanced ones, then they could like target things and be like ridiculously accurate. Like they were hitting 6 times more effective, like over half the time or around half the time they would hit their target. It was insanely better. So this was why we were starting to invest in this stuff, and we're still doing this sort of thing today. We're still making very advanced weapons with these semiconductors, and they get really complicated nowadays. We don't have details on that, obviously, because it's all classified.
I think it's odd too that during the Persian Gulf War, right after 9/11, they televised that war.
What do you mean right after 9/11? You mean after Vietnam?
No. After was it 1991 when the towers fell?
No, it was 01.
2001.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, that one. That's the war they televised.
Yeah, it was the first really televised
to show
war,
how good. Yeah, and really they haven't done it much since.
Well, no, because when you televise war, people hate war. I think that's the main issue.
Yeah.
Like,
Although Mom watched it every day because she was down on her back and she was home, and but I don't think it really made sense to her that people are dying.
Yeah.
It's like there was like that disconnect, which was I just thought the whole thing was weird.
Yeah, it's probably something that we should get more information about, because then people are less likely to be happy about it. Especially if we lose people of our own and you can actually see it. It's miserable.
Yes.
War sucks. Go figure. All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to hop back in time a little bit, because we're going over to a different set of things. This is with TSMC. Now, TSMC is this huge... basically, it is just a fab, right? A fabrication facility that makes transistor or semiconductors and all this good stuff, chips basically, for other people, and they don't make anything themselves. So this is back in the 1960s. Taiwan took some steps to join the international supply chain of semiconductors and sort of up its security arrangement with the United States. By the 90s, the development of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, was really starting to get online, and they emerged as a government-backed facility that was like started becoming very important to the rest of the world. So, Morris Chang is the man who, if I'm remembering correctly, he basically started this. Let me double check this real quick. He was 54. He used to work for Texas Instruments. And he went over to Taiwan because he was like getting bored. He wanted to like, be in charge of stuff. And he became the leader of the most advanced electronics research institute in Taiwan. He envisioned basically developing a semiconductor company that fabricate chips that customers designed, a foundry, serving these quote-unquote fabless chip design firms. Now, fabless chip design firms, they were basically people who would just design chips using the software, right? And then they would send them off to a fab, this foundry right here. In this case, it's TSMC, to get those made and they get sent back. And basically, he did this so that it would be more appealing to everybody else. They wouldn't design any of their own chips, so they wouldn't directly compete with everybody, which made them a lot more appealing than some of these other fabrication companies like Intel, for example. And basically, let me see here, the shift towards using TSMC for all these fabless companies reduced the share of chips made in the U.S. from 37% in 1990, right, down to 13% in 2010. As like Taiwan, especially, Singapore, South Korea, kept spending heavily to boost their domestic semiconductor industries. And this is not something that we do because, for the most part, the Silicon Valley type stuff, they were all, for the most part, selling just to consumers, and they started like really ignoring any of the government stuff, and the government started ignoring them. So after this happens, you got more and more of these firms designing semiconductors and outsourcing all their production to TSMC. Whew. I know we're jumping around in time a little bit here, but this stuff all happens in some weird interconnected way. Back in 1992, you have John Carruthers, who's an Intel research and development person. He realized the industry would need to make new types of lithography tools to make stuff smaller and smaller. So we have TSMC, they're all making stuff, like in the future, 2010. The way they got there is based on the stuff that this guy was doing back in the day. You need smaller and smaller types of lithography tools to make transistors small enough for the next generation of semiconductors. And the way that they had to do it, because they were running out of this ability to use normal visible light. That's what photolithography uses. It uses all visible light stuff. They start moving up the spectrum as you go, because the smaller the wavelength, or the bluer the light, the more, the smaller the like patterns you can put on any sort of a chip. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Okay, so you need to go, well, once you run out of visible light, you're going to have to start going into something else. You're going to go into UV light. And then you go further and further into the extreme UV. So visible light is something like 400 to 700 nanometers, right? So 400 is blue, 700 is red. He wanted to use EUV light, extreme ultraviolet light, and get down to a wavelength of 13.5 nanometers to make chips.
Daggone, that's
Wow.
extreme.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Now, this is the fun part. So, Intel never made its own EUV lithography tools. And during this time, you got a bunch of American companies that are all like getting beat out by all these Japanese companies like Nikon and Canon, right? That's why we have all these cameras now. And they never used EUV either. In fact, it was the Dutch company ASML was the only one that started producing EUV lithography tools. And Intel was one of the sets of people who spent tons of money trying to get this EUV stuff up and running. Right? I think they donated like $10 billion for research into this specific thing. And it ended up that only one company was making this stuff, and that's ASML. Sorry, I keep burping. I don't know why. I'm like swallowing air while I'm talking. It's awful.
Mhm.
So we'll get back to that in a little bit. Also during this time, Japan started surpassing the United States in memory chip production. This is back in like the late 80s, so just before they started thinking about this EUV stuff. And the US, we just stopped making basically all kinds of chips in general, especially nowadays. Especially
Doesn't that seem kind of like silly?
well, it does seem silly until you think about this, at least. So I thought so too.
Okay.
The issue is new fabs, advanced fabs that you need for making these sorts of new chips. If you want to keep up to date with the most current version of everything, cost something like $20 billion. And basically no company is going to upfront that cost.
No.
And the reason why the other companies, right, for example, TSMC, will do this is because they're backed by the government. So they were able to use that extra backing to build these things out, basically. And it also takes years to get the stuff online. So even if you had a new fab, because we have waited so long to do this, it would take like a decade for us to get up and running and catch up, if ever, you know?
Yeah.
Which is huge. And basically nobody can afford that right now.
Yeah, it is.
So you have a bunch of these fabulous chip firms that start coming up. They start sending their production to TSMC. And basically, the people who benefited basically the most from this is Apple. They relied on Samsung to design and produce chips for various versions of the iPhone. And they relied on other companies to design chips for functions as memory, blah, blah, blah. Later on, they started producing their own stuff because they didn't want anybody else to do it, but they couldn't get away from using specific chips for non-like CPU-related things, but they started doing their own CPU and sending that over to TSMC. So you only had a few companies that could possibly do this EUV stuff, right? You have Intel, Samsung, and TSMC were the only ones who had enough money to do it. But the issue is, Intel, the only US company in that list, screwed up this opportunity that they had to become like the dominant chip company in the EUV area. And they waited basically too long to transition over to EUV, while TSMC, this is despite the fact that they funded the development of EUV. TSMC had basically half of the EUV tools in the world by 2020. And as a result, only Samsung and TSMC produce today's most sophisticated processors because they're the only ones that really have this EUV stuff up and running. Intel has had, I think it's something like 10 years of setbacks trying to get this 13.5 nanometer thing up and running. And we're starting to move on to 7 nanometer processes. So, like, this is an issue.
They dragged their feet too long.
They really, really did. All right, so now we're... Yeah?
It seems kind of odd too, and like not really smart. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket. There's like, it doesn't take much if it's down to just 2 or 3 companies for a one disaster or one hostile country to like either take over or stop the whole thing. It just, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think we were thinking.
No, we weren't. So...
Or the world in general.
I think it's at least partially the fact that the government, like these other countries, the government had some foresight and was like, oh, we should definitely fund these places because, you know, it's going to be helpful in the long run. And the U.S., we thought, oh, we're just like, we're so far ahead of everybody else, right? We're going to be fine.
Yeah.
But then all this stuff is slowly eroded away, and now we're no longer the most advanced chip designers in the world, right? We just aren't.
Yeah.
It's just not a thing. Or at least we can't make them. We might design them, but we can't make them because we don't have the equipment set up. We can't have it actually working. So that's a huge issue. And we're only now starting to understand, oh, maybe we should actually start doing something about this. This has only been like, I think we started to think about it in the Obama years, and then like towards the end of the Obama years. So this is not that long ago. And then during Trump's presidency, we also started thinking about it a little bit more, and Biden's, and like it's been within the last 12 years. Like it's not good.
It's like we're just going to have to like forget that and come up with a brand new thing and start fresh.
No.
We'd be better off.
Yeah, but no.
So the good thing is that we still make the software, right? And we're the only people who make the software that's used for all this stuff. And we make a few other things that are necessary for the production of these chips, but that's the only thing we have going for us. And then there's a few other countries that have necessary components in the supply chain, basically.
Well, that may be the only thing that saves us.
Currently, it is literally the only thing that I think that is saving us. If they could use different software, they could use different other supplies for some things, then we'd be boned. Anyway, moving on to the big issue that we're currently running into, aside from the fact that like all this stuff is very sensitive. I mean, especially since you got Japan and like Taiwan, all these places that are not like necessarily the safest places to be having these giant chip fabs.
Because there's earthquakes,
there's hurricanes,
there's tsunamis, there's little islands,
there's
basically.
volcanoes. Like it's not good.
Yeah,
it's not good.
Yes.
In fact, it's happened before that I think it was like there was an earthquake that really seriously disrupted things at one point that caused some issues. You had COVID, which caused different issues, mostly not because of the actual chip production. It did slow down production a lot. But in the US, it's because we were dumb and just like all the auto manufacturers just like canceled all of their orders, and then they got to the back of the line. And because they were still ramping up production over on the other side of the in like Taiwan and stuff, then you had they were at the very back of the line, and you had all the actual like Apple and things getting all the chips. So that was mostly just like bad luck. I mean, bad choices on their part, but still, it disrupted production, and people saw that was a huge deal. If you've only got one place that produces these chips and they get backed up, then that has huge ramifications for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going to move into China. So currently China remains like really deeply dependent on chips and other products that tech companies in Silicon Valley and design and make in the US and other allied nations. For example, Chinese government is using artificial intelligence to track dissidents. All these chips are made or designed by companies like Intel and Nvidia currently. So because of this, because of their reliance on Western technology, China's government devised a plan called Made in China 2025 with the goal of increasing their domestic chip production and reducing the reliance on imported chips over 10 years, ending in 2025. It started in 2015. And basically, Taiwan got a little bit worried that China was going to extend its red supply chain, is what they called it, to include a bigger piece of the semiconductor industry. And the Chinese state owns and finances many of the entities that portray themselves as private equity investment firms. And they sort of constitute this like way of being able to seize foreign chip firms, right, outside of China, which is not good. So because of this, and because of this like big push, you have Huawei, who is a Chinese maker of like telecom devices. So basically, they're making phones and things. And they also make radios on cell phone towers, etc., etc. They were once the leading seller of smartphones. Now they're among the 3 largest sellers of cell tower equipment, along with Nokia in Finland and Ericsson in Sweden. But basically, they're dumping tons and tons of money and investments to develop technologically sophisticated stuff, weapons, for example. Ever since the U.S. demonstrated its really good precision back in the Persian Gulf War. And the Chinese advances in military technology include like anti-ship missiles, anti-satellite weapons, and they're getting way, way, way better very quickly. In fact, all of these concerns apparently drove the Donald Trump administration to ban exports of U.S. chips to Huawei. And that by itself just kind of really screwed up the company because like they depended on these US chips. And this is something that was probably honestly kind of necessary. for the U.S. to like stay somewhat ahead, because if they kept making this stuff based on our equipment, they were going to have these very, very advanced phones, weapons, towers, whatever. They're going to have very advanced equipment that, is not good for us because we're not really happy with China and they're not happy with us most of the time, as it happens.
And it could have been used against us.
And it could have been used against us in theory. Probably not like with actual bombs and things like that, but we can't really get close to the Chinese coast now, or in a lot of areas, because of how advanced their weapons are now. Like, it's just not a thing. Like, their base, it's half impenetrable to us, just like we're pretty impenetrable to everybody else. They're getting to be that level of advance.
Yeah.
But because they didn't have the chips that have made Huawei sell the part of its smartphone business, to sell off part of its smartphone business and get rid of its server business. Currently, TSMC has agreed to open a fab in Arizona. I think that this fell through, actually, though. This book might be slightly out of date. But U.S. national security officials have some issues with Taiwan being in the area, just because, it's Taiwanese at that point and it's not a U.S. thing. They debate about such actions as pressuring TSMC to deploy the new technologies in the United States and Taiwan at the same time, or to match the expenditures in Taiwan dollar for dollar with those at TSMC facilities in Arizona, Japan, and Singapore. Basically, the reason they want to do that is so that the Taiwan version of TSMC does not get too far ahead of everybody else, and we're not stuck with the last generation chips and things. And that's basically where we stand today. We've got no U.S. companies that are really making advanced chips in the U.S. anymore. Intel was the only one that was thinking about doing it. And they have screwed that up royally. And this is because they just weren't thinking far enough ahead. They didn't really apply themselves to that. Also, it's just very difficult to make these sorts of things. But the other thing with Intel is that they're sort of falling behind now, also because they never made GPUs, really. And they basically didn't see AI coming, right? So AI uses effectively graphics processing units, right? GPUs, which are the things that people use for graphics cards, but they also train AI. And the reason they're good for that is because they're a bunch of tiny little processors, effectively, that all work together in parallel to do things. And it could be like rendering your screen, or it could be, training ChatGPT, right?
How could they not have seen AI coming?
I don't really know, but NVIDIA really got on the thing. So basically, NVIDIA sort of lucked into it. What they did was they were making their graphics cards for gamers, and then you had some researchers at universities just around, and they found out that the researchers were using their cards to train AI models or do some software programming with them. So they made something called CUDA, right? CUDA is NVIDIA's programming language. It's basically C++ with some extra bells and whistles that allow you to do parallel computing. I've used CUDA before. It's been iterating so fast. It's way more user-friendly when I started using it. But anyway, it's very good. And basically all the AI models and stuff like that are built on using CUDA on the back end. And CUDA is something that you can only use with NVIDIA GPUs. So basically they locked that in, and they've been heavily investing in making cards specifically to be used for AI purposes now. And
that was smart.
Intel completely missed out on this. They started making GPUs, but they are so far behind at this point. NVIDIA is basically king of the GPU world right now. You've got a couple other companies that are doing some stuff like Intel and AMD, but they're just too far behind right now. AMD is great for gamers. It's not good for AI stuff. NVIDIA is the only thing that's making AI stuff right now. So Intel, basically the only thing that they are really getting any money from right now is from servers, right? And that's just for the CPUs and servers. And a lot of servers are moving away from using their higher end CPUs and moving more towards just spending their money on the GPUs to do this AI stuff. So they're kind of boned.
Wow.
Also, past me should have bought some NVIDIA stock, I'll tell you that, because they are going up like crazy. It's ridiculous. But yeah, so that's basically where we're at now. Chips are very important. There's a ton more detail in this book. I would say read the book if you were really interested in this sort of stuff. You get a lot more personality from all the different people, all the different individuals in the story, what their motivations were. There's one guy, I can't remember, I want to say he was the guy in charge of Intel. But he said, he heard somebody say, real men have fabs, talking about these like fabrication facilities to make these chips, and he kept that in his mind for like ever and never wanted to get rid of his fab because real men have fabs, even though foundries like fabrication facilities are so incredibly expensive to maintain and run. It's ridiculous.
Well, he was a real man.
He was a real man. He kept it. Also, Intel, they tried to do the same thing that TSMC was doing, where they would like make other people's chips, but then they would be very secretive about their process, and they would be just very secretive about everything. And nobody wanted to use them because they were also competing with Intel, right? So that's the other reason why TSMC became so huge, is because TSMC will make anything for anybody, and they will not take anything from you because they don't make any chips like of their own. They just
See, that was a smart way to go because they would, that was a very smart way to go.
Like Intel should have had a separate fabrication division that operated maybe like TSMC with guarantees that they would not copy anything and were very open about their process. Then maybe they would have done better and we could have had a lot more of this stuff in the US. But they were too secluded, too greedy, and it was just the wrong mindset that they had. I mean, you could have legally separated these two things out. Sort of like, okay, so you used to work for BAE Systems. The B in BAE stands for British, but even though BAE was owned by the British company BAE, the version that I worked at was effectively completely independent from BAE in England or whatever. And it was just an arm, so they got the money from the US, but they had basically no control over the individual things that were happening, and they didn't have any knowledge of what we were doing, right? Because that would be a national security risk. You can't know what the secret stuff that we're doing in the U.S. So they should have done something like that, just have this very separate foundry thing, still owned by Intel, but operating as more like a TSMC type of thing. But yeah, read the book. It's fantastic. There's so many interesting characters in there. And hearing all their motivations and stuff like this and all the interactions with people. They go into like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and all them a little bit too. They talk about how we transitioned in the U.S. from working for the government to going over to consumer electronics and PCs in different sections. They talk about the motivations of the Samsung guy to like just, start making chips even though he was a noodle business. All kinds of fun stuff.
That's my favorite story out of this book so far. I mean, it sounds interesting. It really does.
It is an interesting book.
More so than I expected.
It's kind of long and it's kind of dry at times, but it's a good book. And I don't know. It's interesting. I know that my notes and stuff were sort of all over the place, but like, it's hard to summarize this book because there's so much like hopping around in time, and you'll follow through lines of certain stories and then have to hop back a bit to see context for somebody else. It's a little bit difficult to follow in that sense, but everything makes sense in the end. And I just had that summary, and then I kept thinking of other things that had happened during the book. So it's a good book. Check it out if you like computer chips at all,
or just like the whole overview of what's going on in the world with that, because that's a real important part of our society right now.
Oh, it's huge, yeah.
And the way it would take nothing for someone to really mess it up.
Exactly.
Because you take out one part and, everybody else falls.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing. Like, what if TSMC went down? What if something happened? It's effectively just a single company, single building for a lot of these things. If that got taken out, if there was a bad earthquake, I mean, they say that the facility can resist like a Richter 9 scale earthquake, but Unless something,
Well, I mean,
unless
it could
you
be
actually get that, even
it
if
could be
does.
something like even crazy. It could be something like, I don't know. I know it's like remote, but like something fell out of the sky and hit it.
It's possible. Or what if some, like a
Um,
bad actor just said, oh, we want to go in there and really cause some havoc and just blow
Yeah.
up the building.
Yeah.
Or one of the machines. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
it can make a huge difference. And yeah, basically. Like currently the only leverage
sounds
that we
very
have is that
vulnerable.
we have some of the things that would bottleneck the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
We would bottleneck some of them. Like, I mean, we have NVIDIA, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we have obviously the software and we have Intel, but we don't produce most of that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's
Well,
like,
what if
it's
something
iffy.
happened to that? I mean, it shuts down everything because
Yeah, we don't have good redundancy. We don't have good resiliency. And I don't know. It's a little bit too interconnected. I mean, like, I'm all for like global trade. That's great. But we definitely goofed up a little bit because in theory, if you have global trade, this globalization type stuff, the government is not actually helping any of the other things. They're just trying to make a level playing field. And we goofed up by not investing in this stuff. And every other country that's really big into this really heavily invested in it. So we fell behind as the US, which is not good. I mean,
no. And all countries should have some kind of self-reliance.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can't.
Even if it's not competing on that kind of scale, it's still being able to do it.
Oh, yeah. No, basically none of the.
And right now we can't even do it. Yeah, nobody can, I guess.
Yeah, the only company that can, I mean, there's like 2 or 3 companies that can right now, and you got basically Samsung and TSMC, and then Intel maybe, but we're goofed up on Intel right now. So, I mean, like, there's not very many countries that can even make stuff like this in theory. Like, no place in Europe could do it. It would have to be Europe that did it, right? The whole thing.
Yeah.
The US could do it if we actually spent the money on it, but then we have issues with higher labor costs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's all kinds of stuff. But yeah.
Not a lot of forethought.
Nope.
For most people. So, I mean, some of them did. I guess the TSMC really, they were on the ball.
Yeah, but they're not US. The US is very much a short-sighted sort of thing. It's something that we have gotten into recently, and I say recently over the past, like, however many years, is only short-term investments and stuff like this because you got to please the shareholders, and we do things basically by the quarter right now, which is not good for this future-proofing type stuff. You can't do stuff by the quarter when some stuff takes you 5-10 years to get spun up. You know? You just can't do it.
Yep.
It's just, that is how you lose. And they'll do stuff like, for example, cutting a bunch of their workers back to make their quarter look good for the investors. And then they're boned because they don't have the workers who are doing the work that they needed to be doing for the stuff 5 years down the road.
Yeah.
So, yep, it's not good. But yeah, that's all I got about the book. It was fun. Check it out. It's a very interesting read. It's a little long. It's like 400 and something pages long. But it's worth it.
It's more interesting than I thought it was going to be. I don't know what I was expecting, but that was not it.
Yeah. Well,
there's more of a story to it, I think.
There is more of a story to it. And actually, if you read the book, the story is better. Like, I'm not doing a very good job of reporting all this stuff just because, you know, I've got an hour. The book had like 20-something hours, and it was just a lot more detailed, a lot more, I'd say, interesting about each of the individual pieces. And it shows how stuff interconnects a little bit better because there's a lot of nuance and a lot of different people making decisions in context that make sense. But he also gives us like overarching things like, this made sense in context, but later on this stuff happened, you know?
Yeah.
But the current state we're in right now is we don't make enough chips. We don't make the good chips. Those are all made overseas. And if anything happened in any one of these overseas facilities, it's going to screw up the whole world. Like the whole world.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep. It's crazy.
There's your warning.
Yeah, guys, we need to get on this. Pay attention.
Yeah.
The issue is all these like older politicians have no idea what any of this stuff even is, so they just don't even think about it. And then when it's brought to their attention, they just like, oh no, we're fine, blah 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 blah. We just got to do stuff better and faster. It's like, yeah, we needed to do that 10 years ago. You know?
Yeah.
There are clearly more important things to worry about.
I swear, I think they need to
catching up.
invest in like the next step, which is probably beyond this. And I don't know what it is because, I'm totally ignorant when it comes to this stuff. But there's got to be a different way to do it, like there was with the semiconductors from the transistors.
Yeah.
There's probably something else because we're not going to catch up at this rate.
No, I mean, it would be very, very difficult for us to catch up, and it's going to take a long time if we ever do. So
we just need to like go forward with something like, else. And
I mean, if anybody
be
can think
smarter
of
next
something new, then that would be fantastic. I just don't think that there's not a way to. There are other processes right now that exist, but nothing's as fast and as reliable as, in this case, it's EUV, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an issue.
Yeah.
It's a good book, guys. Read it.
I did manage to eat a whole bag of popcorn and finish 2 puzzles on my phone while you talked.
She didn't even offer me one piece of popcorn.
Nope. It was all mine.
Oof.
I'll make you your own if you want.
No. Okay.
I did think about potato chips every time you said chip, though. So I'm glad I had a snack.
Yeah. We all talked about it. Well, y'all said what you were thinking of whenever you said transistors. And every time for me it was twisted transistors.
Twisted transistors.
I don't even know that.
It's a song by Korn.
Oh, okay. Like, I don't even know what that relates to.
I did think of that. But like,
Every single time it was said, it just looped through my brain, and I was like, man. Okay. So our next episode, we are going to do a new curiosity from Zach and Carla. I know we talked about this, but I didn't write it down in my outro. So
Hypnosis.
Hypnosis. Okay. Very good.
you got hypnotized and forgot.
I did.
It worked.
Oh, no. Then we're going to do an episode on my nonfiction pick, Somebody Feed Phil, the book by Phil Rosenthal. And I think, I don't know, we might do some actual recipes from the book, which is all places he went and recipes he got from the first season.
I want to do that coffee brewed in your cup.
Yeah.
It's like you would like that
I really
one.
think that would be fun. And a couple of other things.
That sounds fun, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll send you a recipe that we're
Yes.
going to do so you can try it too.
Yes. And then we're going to do Ariel's deep dive pick, which is Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin. And then we're going to do a new book chat.
Which I have stuff for.
Yeah.
I read books, guys.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's time for us to sign off. But before we go, only the best libraries have librarians who don't shush you.
Just bore you to death with chip talk.
Chippies.